it said that it would be based on UN 242, crucially excluding other UN declarations on Palestinian rights. Now, you know very well that there's been a long debate about this for many years. The UN 242 is completely rejectionist. It says nothing about Palestinian rights. It talks about Palestinians as having it says a just solution to the refugee problem. That's the only reference to Palestinians. So UN 242 is a totally rejectionist agreement, nothing about Palestinians. From the mid-70s, lots of other declarations came along about Palestinian rights. The U.S. has blocked them, vetoed them at the Security Council, blocked them at the General Assembly. All are excluded from the permanent settlement. That's a very crucial fact. UN 242 alone is to be the basis for the permanent settlement, not the UN declarations on Palestinian rights. Secondly, what's UN 242? Well, you don't answer questions like that by looking in dictionaries or selecting pronouncements that you happen to like. The meaning of international declarations or international law is determined by the doctrines and the practice of the powerful. You can have illusions about this if you like, but it's not sensible to have illusions if you're vulnerable and defenseless. Those are conditions in which one should face reality. If you want to get a job in a university, you can have illusions, but that's a different story. In this case, the United States, which runs the show in the Middle East, has made it extremely clear for a long time what UN 242 means in practice. The record is clear, and it is senseless to ignore it, and for the victims, dangerous as well. Here's the basic facts, which aren't controversial. UN 242 was reached in 1967 at a U.S. initiative. The U.S. essentially pushed it through, and it explained what it meant. UN 242, first of all, was rejectionist, nothing about Palestinians. But it did mean full Israeli withdrawal from the territories in return for full peace. That's the essence of it. And that indeed was the U.S. interpretation. The only qualification was that there could be minor and mutual territorial adjustments. So if a border, has to be straightened out, it could be straightened out. But it had to be minor and mutual. That was the U.S. position. It was formalized in 1969 as the Rogers Plan. And that remained the U.S. position until 1971. In February 1971, there was a major turning point in Middle East diplomacy, crucial turning point. What happened is that President Sadat of Egypt accepted the U.S. position solely with regard to Egypt. He took a position which was, again, completely rejectionist, nothing about the Palestinians, and in fact saying nothing about the West Bank and the Golan either. But he agreed to a full peace treaty with Israel if Israel would withdraw to the pre-June 67 Israel-Egyptian borders, which is exactly the U.S. position. Israel make a decisive choice. Was it going to continue to maintain its traditional position, which means it would line up with Egypt against Israel, or would it shift its position and adopt the Israeli interpretation saying only partial withdrawal? There was an internal conflict in the United States. Could have gone either way. The way it went was Henry Kissinger, who was then National Security Advisor, he won out in the internal bureaucratic conflict, and the United States accepted his position, which is what he called stalemate, meaning no negotiations, no diplomacy, just reliance on force. So Sadat's offer was rejected, and the United States changed its interpretation of UN 242, which in the real world means that UN 242 changed its meaning. And that's an important fact to recognize. From that time on, UN 242 means what the United States says it means, which is, because those with the force determine these things, it means partial withdrawal as the United States and Israel determined. At that point, the United States and Israel were in complete international isolation. The rest of the world interpreted 242 differently. In that isolation became more extreme in 1976. In January 1976, the Security Council debated a resolution, the first one, which incorporated all of UN 242 in the exact wording, but added to it a call for Palestinian rights, first time. So it in fact called for a two-state settlement of the kind that has since become a familiar idea, with UN 242 and Herzog, later president. According to him, the PLO actually prepared the resolution. I don't know whether that's true, but they certainly supported it vigorously. The United States vetoed it. Then it did so again several times later, voted alone against General Assembly resolutions and so on. I won't go through the story. Incidentally, on the side, it's an interesting and to me amazing fact and very revealing that the PLO seems to have forgotten its public and open support for a two-state settlement in 1976 in quite unambiguous terms, more unambiguous than ever since. Commonly in the Palestinian literature, the PLO literature, this decision is traced to 1988, but that's not correct. It was a public, open, and vigorous support in January 1976, which seems to have disappeared from the memory of the PLO. It's also suppressed everywhere else. That's a sign of rather deep confusion, in my opinion, which also ought to merit some thought. Well, without going on with the details of this, which are interesting, but there's no time. From 1971, UN 242 means partial withdrawal, as the U.S. and Israel determined unilaterally, and there is to be no recognition of Palestinian rights. That's the U.S. position, and that is built into the Declaration of Principles explicitly. The permanent settlement is to be solely on the basis of 242, meaning as the U.S. interprets it, and none of the other resolutions calling for Palestinian rights. There is nothing to be gained by illusion about these matters and much to be lost. Well, what about recall sentence 1 referred to an Israeli commitment to withdraw from the occupied territories, which was stopped by Netanyahu. That's just not true. Israel made no commitment ever to withdraw from the occupied territories. That is clear and unambiguous. It was stressed by Rabin and Peres and the officials responsible for settlement, all of whom announced plans not to withdraw very publicly and implemented these plans. In fact, construction and development in the territories increased after Oslo, after the Declaration of Principles. Netanyahu didn't really change very much in this regard, apart from style. Furthermore, all of this construction and development is not in violation of the Declaration of Principles, nor is it in violation of Oslo II, which is written carefully in such a way as to permit it under various guises. And nothing is gained by pretending otherwise. Let's turn to the second statement. Under the Oslo Agreement, Palestinians were supposed to have had control over water, telecommunications, and transport. That is completely false. The Declaration of Principles says nothing whatsoever about the matter. Oslo II, on the other hand, this 350-page thing, which should be read carefully, that does say a lot, and it says the opposite. It says that Israel, it says in specific detail, down to the last, cubic millimeter, it says that Israel keeps almost all the water, even in the final settlement. It gives the exact figures. Israel maintains control over transportation, sometimes in ways that are quite astonishing. I'll explain it if you like. As far as telecommunications, the same is correct. Israel imposes strict limitations, including complete control of anything related to the areas that it intends to keep, and prior Israeli authorization of anything that the PLO does in Area C, which, as you know, is 70% of the West Bank. So those statements are just the opposite of the truth, completely wrong in every respect. What about the third statement? The PLO insisted on sticking to the text of the initiative made by former U.S. President Bush, which involved the implementation of UN Security Council resolutions on Palestine. Again, that's just the opposite of the truth. There is no record of any initiative by President Bush, and it is very unlikely that such an initiative was made in secret. As I mentioned, the U.S. vetoed the crucial Security Council resolutions relating to Palestinian rights every time they appeared, and they are explicitly excluded from the Declaration of Principles and Oslo II. The Bush administration has never modified its official policy, nor has any subsequent administration, meaning the Clinton administration, has never modified the official U.S. policy, Bush administration policy, in December 1989. That policy was official policy, endorsed the consensus agreement of the Shamir-Peres government as the only negotiations options. Palestinians were allowed to discuss these, but nothing else. These call for first principle is that there can be no additional Palestinian state between Israel and Jordan. The phrase additional is meant to imply that there already is a Palestinian state, namely Jordan, so that issue is moot, it's over, and there can be no additional Palestinian state. Point number two is that the future of Gaza, Judea, and Samaria, the occupied territories, will be settled according to the basic guidelines of the Israeli government. That's position two. And that's official U.S. policy. There are no other U.S. initiatives. This has been barely modified in the Madrid proceedings, Declaration of Principles, and Oslo II. Again, in fact, about the only change that's taken place since then is the willingness to accept the PLO as a partner to these arrangements. Again, there is no point in pretending otherwise to ourselves or anyone else. Well, what about the fourth point, Israel giving guarantees at Oslo regarding Jerusalem, although they were in secret, but the efforts to Judaize Jerusalem violate them? Well, I can't discuss secret guarantees, of course, but it's very hard to believe that they exist. The public pronouncements and actions, more importantly, are radically in contradiction to these alleged guarantees. As for Judaizing Jerusalem, that's not a Netanyahu policy. That's been the labor policy since 1967. Teddy Kollek, who was, praised as the great humanitarian, he took particular pride in having done nothing for the Arabs of Jerusalem. He, in fact, announced this with enormous pride. He said, "I've never done a thing for the Arabs of Jerusalem." He said, the only thing I've ever done for them is in their work. I did allow them to have sewage systems, but that's because Jews would suffer if there was cholera spreading from the Arab district, and policies were implemented along those lines. This is all public record. You don't have to search very far to find it, and you can see it happening on the ground. You don't have to read it. Labor certainly has had a firm commitment to Judaize Jerusalem, and it's extremely hard to imagine that there were any secret commitments to the contrary. Here, Jerusalem is understood to be an indeterminate entity. I had a chance to look at some of it this morning, expanding in all directions, as you know, reaching practically to Jericho to the east, including Ma'ale Adumim, effectively splitting the West Bank in half and cutting it off from what remains of Arab Jerusalem. These plans have not materially changed with the transformation to labor and Likud. There may be changes in speed or tactics or something, style mainly, in my opinion. So take what Israel calls Har Choma. The announcement to build 6,500 units for Jews only, of course, in Har Choma was taken by the Peres government, made officially by the Peres government in February 1996, with a plan for groundbreaking to begin in exactly a year, which is exactly when it happened, this time under the Netanyahu government. There were also announced at the same time much more important plans, I think, namely the ones extending construction to the east of Jerusalem towards and including Ma'ale Adumim, and as you know, those were recently endorsed, authorized, and implemented on time, on schedule, but now by the Likud government. These projects continue because the United States government pays for them under one or another subterfuge. The American population would be outraged if they knew anything about this. If they knew anything about how their tax dollars are being spent, they don't know. And the reasons carry us back to the failures and the problems that I mentioned earlier. Well, in brief, the picture that Farooq Kadumi presented in India to the non-aligned movement is completely erroneous. That's not the first time, incidentally. I traveled in India in January 1996, gave talks all around the country, and met lots of intellectuals and activists who were highly sympathetic to the Palestinian rights, and who therefore strongly supported the Oslo peace process because they understood it in the terms that the Palestinian leadership had presented it to them. A world of illusion which could not survive free and open debate. The significant support for Palestinian rights is undermined and neutralized by these really suicidal misunderstandings and illusions. Notice that the same people did not support apartheid and the Bantustans. All of that is very similar to the Oslo process. It merits the term peace process as much as what is going on right here. But they did not support it, and they had no illusions about it. If the African National Congress had told them about this wonderful peace process, the homelands and so on, they would have supported it, and that would have undercut the kind of international solidarity that in fact was a major factor in overcoming apartheid and the Bantustan policies. The same is true in South America. I spent a month there last fall, finding very much the same picture. Strong support for Oslo II among people who supported Palestinian rights because they were interpreting it as a world of illusion presented to them by the Palestinian leadership primarily. Same in Europe, but most importantly in the United States, which is the most important case. That's something that I don't think the PLO has ever properly understood. For years, the PLO was very proud of the fact that it was recognized by a huge number of countries and had overwhelming support in the United Nations, all of which was true and irrelevant, because it refused to understand some very simple elementary realities. If there is a vote at the General Assembly of the United Nations of, say, 150 to 2, which is pretty common, that means that the resolution is vetoed if the two happen to include the United States, which is typical. The U.S. and Israel are usually in opposition, occasionally picking up Albania or Uzbekistan or somebody else. The reasons for this have to do with some elementary facts about world order, which is not governed by pretty words, but likes. But that's no help to the people who it claims to represent. And we return to Abdel Shafi's remarks. Well, the second point is that that has to be recognized is that the policies of the powerful states are not immutable. The United States could readily shift its support, shift its policy to support for Palestinian rights, just as it chose at some point to support the overthrow of apartheid, which was crucially important. Wouldn't have happened otherwise. As I mentioned, if the U.S. were to change its position, that would arouse enormous popular support. The population already supports it overwhelmingly without ever having heard anyone propose it. If it became, a public issue and people advocated it, particularly people in power, that support would go from 2 to 1 to something much, much higher. The population would support it on the usual moral grounds, many other cases, including many harder cases than this one, and that would have made a great difference, and it still can. Let's go back to the crucial fact that the whole Oslo process is based on UN 242 alone, meaning excluding all other UN resolutions on the Palestinians, all UN resolutions on the Palestinians. That means UN 242 as determined by the United States, partial withdrawal, as the U.S. decides, with some kind of Bantustan-style arrangement for the Palestinians. Now, it's not a law of nature that the United States government interprets UN 242 in this fashion. It did not interpret it in that way from 1967 to 1971, and the decision in 1971 could have gone either way. The same was true in 1976, when the issue of a two-state settlement reached the international agenda at the Security Council. The United States could have gone along and would have had, there was an overwhelming international consensus, and there would have been overwhelming internal support for it if anyone knew about it. If there had been any public input, that probably would have happened. At least if the Palestinian leadership had understood the importance of reaching public opinion, which instead of, as it did, I'm afraid, alienating the public and contributing to Israeli propaganda efforts, which unfortunately it did, and I don't think that should be, I don't think it makes sense not to remember that experience. It happened, as in the case of other national liberation movements. It's important to recognize what happened, why, how failures came about, and to rectify it. The PLO leadership has not been alone in undermining potential international support by fostering illusions. The Egyptian embassy in the United States has just made public an analysis very much like Kadoumi's, and the message is Americans must support the Israeli Labor Party and the peace process that the United States and Israel have designed and are now implementing. That is a homeland-style, but Bantustan-style settlement, clear and simple. Well, that just undercuts international support, exactly as it would have if the African National Congress and the African states had taken the same stand. The Oslo process exists. There's no point denying that and pretending that it does not. It's a peace process, if you like, but very much in the sense that the homelands policy that South Africa was putting into place 40 years ago was a peace process. Now, in that case, the world didn't accept that as a peace process. South Africa called the homelands states, but the world did not recognize them. If the United States and Israel are clever enough, as I assume they will be, to give the name state to whatever sectors they decide to leave under Palestinian administration, the world will recognize and even applaud that outcome, and that is in large measure a result of failures to develop international solidarity and understanding. It's important to recognize these failures and also to recognize that it's never too late to overcome them. I mean, I'm misleading you by picking one factor, namely the role of the PLO leadership, which is far from the only factor, but it's the one that's sort of under control and the one that relates to the nature of Palestinian society, so that's the one I think that should concern you primarily.
I'm Mark Brzezinski, your host for this weekly program, Mideast Realities, and thank you for watching. If you too are concerned about the situation in today's Middle East and about U.S. policies toward that crucial region of the world, and if you'd like to meet like-minded persons, why don't you come to one of our weekly social meetings? I'll be there, of course. Just give us a call for details.